Hello, everyone. Good morning or good day or good evening, wherever you might be located today. Welcome to this training on the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, for the financial sector. Specifically, we're looking at the banking sector today. Today is part one of a two-part series of training. We're starting today with governance and strategy. And tomorrow we'll go more into detail in risk management and metrics and targets. We appreciate you all being here with us today for this collaborative training, which we've developed jointly with the IFC, with the UN Environment Program, and with CDP. And with that, I'd like to actually pass to our partners, IFC, where we have actually with us two global managers who are going to introduce this program and get it kicked off. So we have from the Climate Business Department, Global Manager Anoop, and we also have from the Corporate Governance and ESG Advisory Department, Martine. And I'd like to pass to you both to kick this session off. Thanks very much.
Tiffany, thank you so much. I really appreciate this, and welcome all to this kickoff of this executive program, TCFD, from climate risk to opportunity, training for banks and financial sector professionals. As Tiffany mentioned, my name is Anoop Jagwani. I'm the manager for climate business at the IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. And for those of you who know the World Bank Group, the IFC focuses on the private sector. And first, let me extend the warmest welcome to hundreds of participants online. I'm looking for the number, but last count, we had 1,500 people who signed up. I think we have a limit to 500, but thank you and welcome to this. And this is, of course, right now focused in the Americas. We were trying to do it in different time zones so that we can accommodate as many people as possible. We all know the impact of climate change is introducing substantial adjustments to the global economy, to the local economies, and operations of banks and financial institutions. This includes the risks as well as the opportunities presented by the changing temperatures, climate-related policy, and changing technologies. The whole world is changing around us on account of climate. Sometimes for the worse, but sometimes there's an opportunity for us in there. For a fifth year in a row, the World Economic Forum assigned environment risk, including climate action failure and extreme weather, as the top global risks in 2022. So the banking sector has a fundamental role in any economy. It is closely connected with the economy, and it has impacted by the physical and the transition risks that the economy faces. So it's important for the banking sector to embrace sustainability and increase climate disclosure and reporting capacity. At the same time, financial markets need robust, comprehensive, and high-quality data on the impacts of climate change. And so this is where the entire role of TCFD comes in. In this context, I'm going to ask Martine. Martine, what is this TCFD framework about? Can you tell the participants?
Thank you, Anoop, and hello and welcome to all of you. As Tiffany mentioned, my name is Martine Valsin, and I'm the Global Manager for Corporate Governance and ESG Advisory Knowledge and Learning at IFC. And during today's training, you'll hear many acronyms, but perhaps the most important one is TCFD, which stands for Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. TCFD is the framework that gives you a roadmap on how to disclose material information that investors need about your climate risks and opportunities. The TCFD framework was launched in 2017. And as of today, we have about 3,800 companies worldwide that are voluntary reporting using this framework. Now, however, regulators are moving from voluntary to mandatory implementation of TCFD recommendations. And some of the factors for the framework's success and uptakes are the following. First, it allows banks to build on existing work undertaken under different reporting frameworks. Also, the recommendations are interconnected and should be seen as part of how a company operates its business. And finally, the four thematic areas under TCFD being strategy, governance, risk management, and metrics and targets form the core elements of the new sustainability and climate-related standards proposed by the IFRS Foundation and the EU. As a result, the efforts that you put into reporting under TCFD will prepare you to report under those new standards in the future. While TCFD adoption in emerging markets currently remains limited, this will change in the coming years as more countries implement policies to support sustainable development goals and the objectives of the Paris Climate Agreement. So now, Anu, back to you, a question for you. Maybe many participants are wondering, what is IFC's role regarding the intersection of banking and climate?
Thank you, Martine. And for those of you who don't know, investments in financial markets accounts for almost 40% of our business every year, and it's almost half our portfolio. And given our commitment to climate action and finance, the financial sector is extremely important for IFC's business. And so, connecting climate and the bank's journey in TCFD and reporting is core to IFC's approach in climate. As part of the World Bank Group Climate Change Action Plan, we made two commitments. One was to increase climate finance to 35%, and also to be aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. By July 2023, we expect 85% of our business to be aligned, and starting July 2025, we're aiming at 100% alignment with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So in a nutshell, we help banks and work with financial institutions in a number of ways. As an investor, we invest equity, provide loans, investments, debt securities, and guarantees. And we work as an advisor. This is key in supporting banks. In fact, today I'm talking to you from Stockholm, where we've organized a program for green bond training for 22 banks from across the world. And this is where IFC is one example of IFC providing capacity to banks. And so we work closely. We invested of our 32.6 billion, which was total IFC's total investment, of which about 12.2 billion was IFC's own account. Of that 12.2 billion, 4.3 billion was directly climate-related investments in clean energy, sustainable cities, climate-smart agriculture, energy efficiency, green buildings, and green finance. So this is part of the 35% target I just mentioned. And as you can see, these are sectors that represent significant business opportunities for IFC. We expect that IFC investments will continue to grow in the climate space. And this is where we want to partner with the banks as well to scale up both the climate finance as well as capacity for the banks. So in a nutshell, that's what we are doing in IFC. And with that, Martine, why don't I ask you to share what's unique about this training?
I think there's a lot that is unique about it, Anoop. First of all, I'm thrilled about today's training, and I think there are several reasons for that. First, it results from a powerful coalition of standard setters and leading organizations. So, it brings together IFC, the United Nations Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative, United Nations Environmental Program, and the Climate Disclosure Project, CDP. So we've all joined forces to develop a learning program specifically targeted at financial institutions to enhance their sustainability and climate disclosure reporting capacity. And second, within IFC alone, we have contributed our knowledge from 3 different programs on climate and sustainability disclosure in emerging markets. And these are the TCFD Advisory Program for Banks, the Beyond the Balance Sheet Disclosure and Transparency Program, and the Green Banking Academy. And third, you will hear from experts at the forefront of developing and implementing climate-related financial reporting. In a nutshell, I think it's a fantastic course, and I wish you will all learn a lot from it. And I wish you two great sessions today and tomorrow. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Martine. And I think we're going to pass it back to Tiffany, and just to acknowledge that IFC is in its 5th year of reporting on TCFD as well. So we're happy to share our lessons through this.
Great. Thank you so much for that great introduction, for really setting the scene for this training program. Just to build on what Martine mentioned, TCFD indeed is a roadmap to help integrate climate-related risks and opportunities into your financial disclosures. And we're here to help you along that road. So I hope this training can be useful for everyone as they're along various parts of that journey. And we're here live with you, so please take that opportunity to ask us questions. We have a number of experts here to answer all of your questions. We will be a group of us facilitating this training, as this is a partnership. We wanted to make sure we integrated all the knowledge of all the different organizations. So facilitating the training today will be myself, the head of the SSE Academy at the United Nations Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative, together with Evan Guy, the policy manager at CDP. We're also joined by Charles Canfield, who is the Principal Corporate Governance Officer at IFC, as well as Maheen Arshad, who's the UNEP Finance Initiative Program Specialist from the TCFD for Banks program. And in addition to these facilitators that are here with you to help talk you through this content, we also have additional experts that are busy typing away in the background. So we have David Carlin as well, who's head of the TCFD for Banks program at UNEP-FI, and Aisha Malik, who's Associate Operations Officer at IFC. So if you see them answering your questions too, you're in very, very good hands there. So with that, I just want to give you a quick overview of our program today, starting with the housekeeping. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, as many of you have. It's great to see that you're coming from all around the globe. Also, please feel free to share your questions with us in the Q&A. If you put your question in the chat, sometimes we lose it because we have so many people interacting in that chat box. So if you have any questions, please just drop those in the Q&A and we'll make sure we get through every one of them. We'll also take a very brief break, just a 5-minute break at the halfway point. Please be prompt in returning because we'll get started promptly after 5 minutes. And all presentation material is being shared with you in the chat. You've been given a link to a handout that was emailed to you. It's also going to be shared a few times in this chat. So please feel free to download that handout, which has all these slides as well as additional notes added in. We will also be sharing a feedback survey at the end of the second session, so the end of tomorrow. And this is what we ask you to fill in to not only give us feedback, but also to get your CPD certificate. So we'll give you more details on getting that certificate next time. Okay, so I'm just gonna, change the slide here. Okay, so we do have a series of learning objectives that we look to cover today. First is to understand the key elements of climate-related financial disclosures as they're recommended by the TCFD, and importantly, why it's relevant for the banking sector. Our second key objective is to identify how climate can be integrated into governance and what role appropriate climate governance plays in organizational resilience. Our third objective is to understand how banks can strategically respond to climate-related risks and opportunities. And finally, to help you to understand how to use a scenario analysis as a tool for climate resilience in your own organization. So as we get started, we just like to know a little bit about each and every one of you. So I'm going to launch just this first poll here, and I appreciate if you take just a moment to answer this question. What we'd like to know is how comfortable you are with the TCFD recommended disclosures. So you may be an expert, or you might be pretty confident with the TCFD, but maybe you might want to understand certain specific elements, or you have a little bit of knowledge and need additional support to move forward, or the final option, you have little to no prior knowledge. There's no correct answer here. This is just helps us gauge where our audience is at to make sure that we're filling in those knowledge gaps. So I'll give you just a few more seconds to fill that in. And so far we have 3 experts with us, so that's great to hear. We'd also like to hear from you. So as we're talking, if you have any experience you'd like to share, please don't hesitate to drop that in the chat. We love to hear from any of the experts on the call as well. Okay, I'm going to close that up now. We have nearly 80% participation, so great. Thanks everyone for that. Okay, so the majority of you have some knowledge but need some support. So that's great to know. So we're going to build on what you already have. those of you with little to no prior knowledge, it's not a problem whatsoever. We'll make sure that we start from a low enough level, but if there's anything that's not clear, please don't hesitate to let us know. If there's an acronym that we've used or words that we've maybe assumed everybody understands, don't ever hesitate to ask, what does that mean? Or can you reiterate that one more time? If you feel like doing this anonymously, you can also do that in the Q&A. That's no problem. Okay, so I'm now going to go over a brief overview of the TCFD. Now, the objective of this session is really to highlight what is this task force and what are the recommendations, where do they come from? After we go through this overview, we will be going more into detail of the 4 core pillars that make up the TCFD. So don't worry too much if you're not fully grasping those 4 pillars. We'll go deeper into them momentarily. But the objective here is really to highlight really where the TCFD comes from and how you can use it. So to get started, it's really increasingly, we're really seeing that there's evidence of climate-related risks feeding into our global and systemic understanding of risk more broadly. Well, we are going to spend a lot of time today talking specifically about climate-related risks. It is important to recognize that it's also interconnected with all other risks. To highlight the prioritization of climate in holistic risk management at the global level, for the 4th year now, the World Economic Forum assigned environmental risks, including climate action, failure, and extreme weather as its top global risks in 2022. Actually, that was the 5th year in 2022. And climate change and its impacts are increasingly one of the top issues that businesses must address and possess a significant risk to the stability of our financial system as a whole, which is why it makes it particularly important for the banking sector. Now, our current financial system has been highlighted as not appropriately considering the risks pertaining to climate change because the time horizons that we use do not align with the time horizons for climate-related risks and opportunities. Mark Carney's Breaking the Tragedy of the Horizon speech in 2015 was really a landmark speech. And if you haven't listened to it, I highly recommend it. He highlighted that despite the systemic threats from climate change, the time horizons for both policymakers and financial markets are too short to take the necessary action. This observation really then paved the way for the establishment of the TCFD to help us to address this issue. Although it is important here to note that the TCFD was developed from a financial perspective and not from the environmental one. So if we're going to take this from a financial perspective, it's really important for us to understand where these risks and opportunities are coming from. So I'd just like to pause on this slide a moment, which you'll have a little bit more detail in your handout. This one's just been simplified a little bit, but to highlight what are these risks that we're seeing and how do they impact our company financially. So we see here that there's 2 types of risks. There's transition risks, and then there's also physical risks. The transition risks are really just the risks related to our transition to a low carbon economy, whereas the physical risks are those risks that we're a little bit more familiar with in terms of weather events and rises in temperature and in water. So let's look at these financial impacts of the transition risks. So what do we mean by these different transition risks? So let's start with policy. A policy risk. Some examples include implementing carbon pricing mechanisms to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, shifting energy use towards lower emission sources, adopting energy efficiency solutions or encouraging greater water efficiency measures, and promoting more sustainable land practices. Now, of course, the financial impact then of that, we have to understand then how those shifts in energy efficiency or in greater water efficiency or in promoting more sustainable land practices might have an impact on our revenues, on our costs, on our cash flow, which can come through, for example, reduced revenues due to reduced distribution capacity or higher costs, or it can come through write-offs or increased costs due to water supply or shortage, etc. Another important risk is litigation or legal risk. And in recent years, we have seen an increase in climate-related litigation claims by property owners, by municipalities, states, insurers, shareholders, and public interest organizations. We also have technology. An important example of technology risk is the development and use of emerging technologies such as renewable energies. We also have battery storage, energy efficiency, carbon capture and storage. And we have to understand how this will affect the competitiveness of certain organizations, their production and distribution costs, and ultimately the demand for their products and services from end users. Now that leads me to also market risks, where we can include here shifts in supply and demand for certain commodities, products, and services, and then also reputational risks, which are tied to consumer or community perceptions of an organization's contribution or detraction from the transition to a lower carbon economy. And then if we look at the physical risks, we have acute and chronic, and acute is really the physical risks where that are event driven, including increased severity of extreme weather events such as cyclones, hurricanes, or floods. And then for chronic physical risks, we refer to longer term shifts in climate patterns, such as sustained higher temperatures that may cause sea level rise or chronic heat waves. And again, the objective is to understand these risks in a way that we can determine what is that financial impact. So pulling over the understanding from the left-hand side there into that financial impact of whether that's impacting our financial performance, or if you can see in that bottom box there, also our financial position, which becomes particularly important in the banking sector. And we'll talk a lot more today about how that might follow through into, for example, your portfolio composition. So we talk a lot about risks, and we will continue to talk a lot about risks, but it's important to also talk about the opportunities. So highlighting the opportunities can have an even in this report, we've shown that by highlighting these opportunities, we can show an even greater financial impact from the opportunities than the risks. So I quite like this report that CDP did. Evan always highlights it in our TCFD training that we do together with stock exchanges. And what it found is that through evaluating 250 companies that represent nearly 17 trillion in market cap, they provided an estimation of the potential financial impact for a proportion of their reported risks and opportunities. Now, the risks came to a total of 970 billion, so not a small amount whatsoever. However, the same companies reported opportunities at the magnitude of about 2.1 trillion. So to just repeat those numbers, the risks were 970 billion and the opportunities were 2.1 trillion. So it's really important that as we're talking about these climate-related risks and opportunities, we're not forgetting about those opportunities, because they indeed will also have a pretty high financial impact on our organization. And of course, if we miss out on those opportunities, they become a risk as well. So what are these opportunities? TCFD also lists a series of opportunities that you need to keep your eyes open for. And they are resource efficiency, which, for example, many companies are seeing direct cost saving from reduced operating costs by improving efficiency across production and distribution processes, buildings, machinery, appliances, transport, mobility, etc. And in particular, in relation to energy efficiency. But this also includes broader materials, water, and waste management. It also links to innovation in technology, such as efficient heating solutions, circular economy solutions, retrofitted buildings, employing geothermal power, offering water usage and treatment solutions, and developing electric vehicles. This can all lead to savings for a company, so that's a clear financial impact. We will discuss this later, but how banks help companies to invest in the upfront costs related to these strategies also becomes relevant for transition plans. Another important opportunity is energy sources. This could include looking at low emission alternatives, such as wind, solar, wave, tidal, hydro, geothermal, nuclear, biofuels, and also things such as carbon capture and storage. The latest data from the International Energy Agency, or IEA, indicated that if we want to meet the net zero targets we've set, we cannot actually invest in any new oil and gas projects. There's been a number of other agencies coming up with the similar findings. This sounds quite threatening, but at the same time, we've seen over the last 5 or so years now that investment in renewable energy capacity has exceeded investment in fossil fuel generation. So the investments are going in the right direction. Another important opportunity here is products and services, which is really looking at innovation and R&D and markets, of course, which is particularly relevant for banks. This is proactively seeking opportunities in new markets or types of assets, which may be able to diversify activities and to better position an organization for the transition to low carbon economy. In particular, opportunities exist for the organization to access new markets through collaborating with other organizations such as governments, development banks, small-scale local entrepreneurs, community groups, etc. Also, there's new opportunities that can be captured through underwriting or financing green bonds and infrastructure, such as low-emission energy production, energy efficiency, grid connectivity, or transport networks. And finally, resilience. You'll hear this word a lot through this training too. The TCFD is really a roadmap towards resilience to make sure your company survives as all these changes are happening around us. And the concept of climate resilience really involves organizations developing adaptive capacity to respond to climate change, to better manage the associated risks, and to seize opportunities. So, as with before, the important thing here is understanding the opportunities in that left-hand box and being able to indicate how they might impact those financial impacts on those right-hand boxes. So with that, I'm just going to give you a quick quiz. If this will pop up here. There we go. So a little poll here. Just give me a moment to launch it. Perfect. Okay. A quick quiz on financial impacts. So what would you say are examples of financial impacts from climate that a bank might report? So your options are revenue growth from increased sustainable financing, impact on talent acquisition due to the perception that your bank is not accurately addressing climate-related issues, fines and judgments from new climate-related regulation, increased competitive positioning as a result of changes in consumer preferences, or all of the above. And I'll just give you a moment to fill that in. Okay, well done, everyone. Many of you have already filled this in, and I must say congratulations. The overwhelming majority of you got this correct. So I'm going to end the poll now in just 3 seconds. So any last answers? Great. Okay, and share the results. So nearly 70% of you said all of the above, which is indeed the correct answer. So the first option, revenue growth, is indeed an opportunity from increased sustainable finance, and this could be from accessing new markets. The second, not addressing climate-related issues poses a reputational risk, which is a transition risk, which can impact talent acquisition, which impacts your financial performance in the long term. Then fines and judgments also hit your balance sheet, so your financial performance, which can result from regulation changes, which is a policy risk and a transition risk. And the fourth one, consumer preferences, again, can lead to an opportunity through markets and also to enhanced resilience. So really well done there, everyone. Okay, from here, we're going to move on to the benefits. Now, resilience is really the key takeaway of TCFD. And I hope if you take nothing else from this session, you take away that TCFD is really a roadmap to help your organization be more resilient, not only for yourselves as banks, but also for the companies that you work with. TCFD is more than disclosure. It's really about the appropriate processes that are in place to ensure the resilience of your organization and the organizations you work with. And it really boils down to that systemic risk of a whole financial system that we were talking about. So let's go over a few of the benefits that you can look forward to from aligning your disclosure with the TCFD. First of all, there's the internal benefits, which is, of course, improved strategic resilience, which we've been talking about. Also, though, the identification of potential climate-related opportunities. And then, of course, improved robustness of risk management processes, which you have to put in place behind the scenes. And we'll talk a bit more about risk management next time. And then improved communication between the board and management on climate issues, which we'll talk a bit more about today as well. However, on top of those internal benefits, there's also a lot of external benefits, such as improved engagement with investors, ensuring preparedness for an emerging climate regulation, improved reputation with customers, employees, and wider stakeholders, and establishing a leadership position among industry peers. So there's clearly a lot of benefit to work on this. So what is it? So the TCFD recommendations were developed to help identify the information needed by investors, lenders, and insurance underwriters to appropriately assess the financial impacts of climate-related risks and opportunities. Now, a few key points to keep in mind with the TCFD's recommended disclosures. First and foremost, they were developed in order to integrate this information that investors, lenders, and insurance underwriters need into annual financial reports. So not into a separate climate report or a separate sustainability report. The objective here is to understand the real financial impact that climate change has on your organization. And in order to make that connection between climate and finance, they need to appear together in the same documents. So first point here, were developed to report climate-related financial disclosures in the annual financial filings. It's also important to note that there were certain sectors that were deemed to be particularly high risk or need additional guidance, and banks lie in one of those sectors, so we'll discuss that momentarily. They're also introduce these two different categories of risks, the transition risks and the physical risks, which we just spoke about, and opportunities. And in order to address those risks and opportunities, they've had to introduce kind of more of a forward-looking perspective. To do that, we use a tool called the scenario analysis, which we'll discuss a bit later. And we look at different terms of time. So short-term, medium-term, and long-term. It's up to the organization to identify what they want to define as short, medium, and long-term, but they should coincide with your organization's usual business cycles. And importantly, they are both qualitative and quantitative. So if you look at the circle on your screen, you'll see that we have governance on the outside, then strategy, then risk management, and metrics and targets in the center. These are all interrelated. However, they often get talked about in their kind of four core areas, these four separate pillars. The governance and the risk management will often be quite qualitative because we're talking about the processes in order to make sure that we're catching these risks and opportunities, whereas risk or strategy and metrics and targets can be more quantitative. So a key question to keep in mind, which I've already mentioned, but we want to make sure it's very clear, is where to disclose this information. A disclosure should, as I mentioned, be provided in the mainstream report, which also is called the annual report, the registration document, the 10K, etc. The intention of the TCFD was certainly not to create a separate TCFD statement, although a number of companies are doing this in order to highlight or emphasize their reaction or their resilience to climate change. It's okay to have a separate report. The importance is you're also then including this in your mainstream report. By doing this, this creates that connection between climate and finance. It also makes this information subject to the same governance processes and sign off as your annual financial report. And very importantly, it makes it accessible to investors as primary users of this information. So keep in the top of your mind that the objective of TCFD is to integrate this into our annual reports. Now, we're back at these 4 core pillars now, and I just want to reiterate again how they differ slightly. The key is to keep them always aligned. So we don't want to see them as silos. These don't operate in silos by any means. However, they have slight nuances in how they operate a bit differently. So governance, of course, we want to understand the organization's governance around climate-related risks and opportunities. And this is really talking about that oversight and accountability in the organization. And then I'm going to skip to the third one, risk management, where we want to understand the organization's processes to identify, assess, and manage climate-related risks. So both governance and risk management, those ones where we have the comments on the bottom of the screen, those look at processes that you need in order to identify and manage and become accountable and have oversight for climate-related risks and opportunities. So the TCFD deems both of these boxes, governance and risk management, to be material for all organizations. So any organization, regardless of its sector or size, should be looking at disclosing information on how they integrate climate into their governance and their risk management. Then strategy, the second one there, is really looking at this from a more financially material perspective. And it's where we want to understand what are those exact risks and opportunities that do have a financial and can have a financial impact on our organization. And here we want to understand the actual and potential impact of climate-related risks and opportunities on the organization's business strategy and its financial planning. Key at the bottom there, where such information is material. So on the strategy component, we have a materiality lens. We want to understand only, we want to disclose only that information that has a financial impact on our organization. Then skipping to the last one, metrics and targets, this has the same materiality lens here. We also only want to use those metrics and targets that are measuring those risks and opportunities that will have a financial impact on our organization. However, GHG emission or greenhouse gas emissions are deemed material or relevant for all organizations. So all organizations can start off with governance, risk management, and greenhouse gas emissions. And then they should determine what is financially material for the strategy component and the other metrics and targets. Now, we mentioned that there are supplemental guidance for certain sectors. Banks is one of those. I'm just going to skip to the next slide so you can see how those supplemental guidance works. So all organizations, even if you have a supplemental guidance, such as a bank, should use the core 11 recommended disclosures. So there's 2 recommended disclosures in governance, and then there's 3 recommended disclosures in the other 3 categories in strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And then additionally, certain sectors have an additional recommended disclosure. So an example is on your screen here. So for strategy A, banks, in addition to providing the information of the core 11 recommended disclosures, should consider also characterizing their climate-related risks in the context of traditional bank industry categories, which is credit risk, market risk, liquidity risk, and operational risk. And so if you use the bank supplemental sector or guidance, which we'll go through what all of those additional recommendations are as we continue today and tomorrow, then you can make sure that you're addressing the particular areas that matter most to banks. So before we move on, I just wanted to give another quick quiz to everyone. Make sure everyone's following along. So this one has no wrong answer. It just to help us understand where you're at. So does your bank prepare its disclosure in alignment with TCFD? I know a few of you said you were experts and that you already had a bit of knowledge, so we should see a few. But just let us know whether you include climate-related information in your annual report, or you currently only disclose climate-related information on a separate or a climate report, or do you not disclose any climate-related information, but you're working on starting that this year? Or finally, no, you don't do any of this and your leadership's not convinced you need to. I'll give you just a moment to finish that up. Okay, I'm just going to end this poll now and share the results. So actually, the majority of you have not started yet. So I hope that we can help you get moving on that. We do share a roadmap to get started. So hopefully after the session, you'll be prepared to start that. For those who've said that they currently disclose information in a separate report, I hope we can help you to start moving that then today into your annual report, which is where we want to start seeing that information. That really helps us to understand where you're all at. Thanks so much for that. Now let's look at how your colleagues are doing, or how the rest of the banking sector is doing. So this is from the latest status report from the TCFD. They put out a status report every year. And if we look back, so I have in here both the 2022 and the, oh, there's a typo on that slide, I just realized. This is 2021 and 2022 status report. So in 2021, the status report by TCFD, we saw that banks were below the all sector average for disclosure in all governance disclosures and all metrics and targets disclosures as well. And banks were also below average for disclosure on financially material risks and opportunities and their impact. So that's strategy A and B. However, banks were above average for disclosure on risk management and for scenario analysis. And then in 2002, things really shifted. So in the latest status report, we found that the banking sector really improved, now leading in both governance and strategy. So we've seen a real increase lately in the banking sector, which is great news for all of you who haven't started, because you have a lot of great practice to follow now. And I highly recommend making use of the TCFD Knowledge Hub, which you can use to find other banks' reports. You can look by geography, by sector to look specifically for banks. You can look for specific companies, and you can see how they're reporting on TCFD related information. Now we are a little bit short on time, so I'm going to skip through a couple of these, but just to note that we have in the handout a couple reports on how banks are doing and giving additional information. And I do highly recommend that you follow the link and do open that report, because they do provide examples of best practice and they show you kind of who's doing what around the world. And that can be really helpful, particularly when you're trying to get buy-in from the top in your organization. I do want to land, however, on actually the next one here, on this one here, because I think this is really important to note and also good inspiration to get started. So early studies show that financial institutions that act early may reap significant advantages. So a good reason to get started. As you can see in this study, it was by Bain and Company. Those who started before started in 2021, they don't really see much differentiation before 2025. Whether they were a pioneer, so they were the first ones to get started on something, a follower, followed quite closely behind the pioneers, or a laggard. However, over time, this gap really widens, with pioneers ultimately growing profits by 25 to 30% more. So this does show that the decisions made today have a dramatic impact on the future. And this is why it is so critical to start making changes today for the impacts that we want to see tomorrow or in the more distant future. We do have a roadmap here for those who are just getting started. I do want to highlight that there's certain key parts here to get started on. They don't have to be in this order, but creating an internal working group can be key to develop a TCFD team. TCFD is really a whole of organization process, and we need everybody involved. Also conducting a gap analysis of existing processes, data and disclosure can help to get started. And I recommend using the SSE's model guidance on climate disclosure. In Annex 1, you can find a checklist that you can use to do this gap analysis. Then you might want to start establishing climate governance, moving on to developing a plan for a scenario analysis, and then integrating climate-related information into decision-making. And you can see here another kind of a map or a step-by-step process that you can use. I'll let you read this in more detail in the worksheet, but what I want to highlight in particular is level 0 to level 1 is unaware to acknowledged. So you might be aware internally of these impacts, but you haven't indicated this in your disclosure. So really the first step is explicitly recognizing in your annual report that climate change has a significant impact on your organization, and putting in place either a policy or a commitment to start acting on climate change. And that's where you can start sharing maybe your roadmap, which can obviously change year on year, but maybe set out a few plans or milestones you have in place. And then that can build into level 2, where you start reporting on maybe your scope 1 and 2 emissions. So your electricity and your own controlled emissions. And then moving into integrating that into business decisions, and then further into strategic decisions. So this is a really helpful roadmap as well, or a phased approach that you can use as you start to get started on this. And one more quick question to see what you might decide to do next. So take a moment just to reflect on what your next steps might be. So what key action will you take next to progress climate disclosure in your organization? First option, establish a TCFD team internally. The second is to conduct a gap analysis of existing reporting. Maybe you'll use the SSE's Annex 1 in their model guidance. Develop a roadmap for TCFD adoption, or establish internal climate governance. And I'll give you just a moment to fill that in, and then we'll move on. Great, so a pretty even spread here. Just going to share the results where they're at now. So the winner by a smidge is to develop a roadmap on TCFD adoption. Definitely recommend this. However, I actually highly recommend doing these in order. So first, starting with establishing a TCFD team internally can really ensure that you have that buy-in from the top. Having a climate champion on the board or at the C-suite level can really help to move this forward. Then conducting a gap analysis, so you already know what data you have and what you can build on. Maybe you're reporting some of this information already, but you haven't specifically identified the climate aspect. Then developing a roadmap of how to move forward, and then establishing that internal climate governance for oversight. Great. So with that, I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Evan, who's going to discuss the climate reporting landscape. Over to you, Evan.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Tiffany. And just as a reminder, yeah, my name is Evan Guy, and I'm with CDP, and it's really great to be with all of you here today. So having really established the importance of connecting climate and finance, and why this matters specifically for banks, in this next section, I would like to provide everyone with an overview of the global reporting landscape and how you might try to understand and navigate it. So we've already established that climate change is a really important issue for financial organizations and banks, but we're also seeing that this is accelerating into major changes in policy, regulation, and standards. And while TCFD ultimately remains a voluntary market-led initiative, many governments and regulators are taking steps to require or encourage disclosures based on the TCFD recommendations. Over 120 regulators and governments from around the world are TCFD supporters, from Belgium to Canada to Ireland, New Zealand, Japan, Sweden, many different countries around the world are TCFD supporters. And then even beyond being TCFD supporters, many countries, again, such as the US, Japan, UK, New Zealand, some others here you see on the slide, and even beyond what's here on the slide, have taken steps to mandating climate disclosure in line with the TCFD. And at this point, as many as 15 jurisdictions around the world have proposed or already mandated TCFD-aligned climate disclosure. So given this large sort of policy and regulatory movement, I'd like to touch on a few sort of key pieces, especially for banks. And so some of them we see here on the slide, which are sort of TCFD guidance and metrics target update. So according to this guidance, banks should provide metrics used to sort of assess the impact of transition and physical risks, climate-related risks on their lending and other financial intermediary business activities in the short, medium, and long term. Metrics provided may relate to credit exposure, equity and debt holdings, or trading positions. And then, as I mentioned on the last slide, we're starting to see TCFD mandates really accelerate across many different jurisdictions. In March this year, we saw the US Securities and Exchange Commission proposal for climate disclosure requirements, which is very much in line with the TCFD. We also have the sort of EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which takes a sort of double materiality approach to climate disclosure by considering a company's climate impacts, not just the risk and opportunities, but also the impacts, but is simultaneously also quite aligned with the TCFD itself. And then we also have the ISSB standards here, which I will get into a bit more detail in a second. We're also seeing that starting to see central banks going through climate stress testing exercises, such as the Bank of England, the ECB, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, the Bank of Canada, and this could increasingly start influencing, and already has started influencing, supervisory and regulatory action. But much of the work on sort of international standardization is really being led through the IFRS Foundation. So in November 2021, almost exactly a year ago, the IFRS Foundation announced the creation of its new International Sustainability Standards Board, more commonly referred to as the ISSB, who was really tasked with developing a comprehensive global baseline of high-quality sustainability disclosure standards to meet investors' information needs. The ISSB was announced at COP26 in Glasgow, and as you can see here on the slide, was welcomed by many world leaders all around the world. The structure of the ISSB requirements is that it will stipulate general requirements, general standards, as well as requirements related to specific themes and specific industries. And particularly, I'd like to draw your attention, the requirements that are proposed in the ISSB, the ISSB has released already, since it was announced and since it was created, 2 exposure drafts, one on those general requirements for sustainability standards, as well as its first thematic standard specifically on climate. And while it will expand beyond that, the first one we've already seen on climate. And that first exposure draft on climate from the ISSB, which will be finalized in the new year, is indeed consistent with the 4 pillars, the 4 recommendations of the TCFD and the 11 recommended disclosures published by the TCFD. Areas where the exposure draft differs from the TCFD recommendations, really mostly reflect differences in some language and level of granularity, and not particularly significant substantive differences in the content and requirements, recommendations of the disclosures. And as you can see here, the ISSB recommendations really build on those TCFD core elements by focusing on those pieces, those pillars of governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. All critical, all matters that are critical to the way that a company operates and ultimately understanding enterprise value. Another thing that banks should be aware of is the task force for nature-related financial disclosures, or the TNFD. We told you there were going to be a lot of acronyms in this presentation. So here's another one. The TNFD is developing a risk management and disclosure framework for organizations to report and act on their evolving nature-related risks, really taking that step beyond climate to look at broader nature-related risks. And the TNFD is in its beta version until January, and there are many different ways to engage, so please visit the link available there. But what's important to know about the TNFD at this point, I'd like to particularly draw your attention to, is that the TNFD, like with the ISSB, really builds on the architecture of the TCFD. It looks at nature-related risks and opportunities and recommends disclosures on the topic related to those pillars of governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. So you can see that it's really aligned with the TCFD itself. And to sort of understand the different approaches and perspectives that can be taken and are taken on sustainability important, I think it's worth having a look at this sort of building blocks diagram that we like to reference. It has three sort of layers to it. The first layer you see is a sort of traditional financial reporting that many of you may be familiar with, whether it's through GAAP or the IFRS's International Accounting Standards Board. Then that next layer, we see sustainability related financial disclosures. This still has an investor focus to the information being reported, but really connects finance with sustainability issues that are material. And that's really what we're getting at with the TCFD, the ISSB, and so forth. And then that third layer, we see sustainability reporting, really looking at information that is beyond what is financially material to your organization, and includes some of the sort of reporting put out by GRI and other jurisdictional initiatives. The TCFD, another thing worth bringing up in this section really is the TCFD 2021 Metrics and Targets Guide that provides sort of good examples of disclosures from both financial and non-financial organizations. As you can see here on the slide, there are examples of disclosures for the risks associated with greenhouse gas emissions from organizations' investments, as well as their transition risks to carbon-intensive sectors such as oil and gas. There is also specific recommendation for the disclosure of non-compliance with environmental laws and regulations, and the reporting organization should really report any significant fines or non-monetary penalties for non-compliance with environmental laws or regulations in terms of the total monetary value of the fines, the total number of non-monetary sanctions, and the cases dealt with through dispute resolution mechanisms. This is sort of update through some of the guidance that we've seen recently from the TCFD. And with that, I know it's time for a break, but two very quick questions just to gauge, to hopefully make sure that I've been clear. The first question very quickly is, the ISSB standards, are they only relevant for organizations using IFRS? True, false, or maybe not sure? I'll give everyone just a quick second to fill that out. Wonderful. Just give another moment. Perfect. Looks like this question might have been too easy for you. You indeed are all following along, and it is very clear. The IFRS ISSB standards are not only just relevant for organizations using IFRS. They are indeed, as you all well noted here, relevant for organizations that are not using IFRS as well. And just because we're short on time, I'll skip ahead here. Another quick question. How should you approach I very quickly went over sort of the changing regulatory environment. There's a lot going on. How do you really think the best way is to approach this? How should you approach this regulatory environment? Should you wait for the ISSB standards that I just went through to be finalized before starting? Or should you start using the core elements of the TCFD, as this will really sort of prepare you and make the transition easier to ISSB and TNFD? Just give everyone a moment, although I'm not sure if I need to. I think I've been hopefully relatively clear, and your answer indeed shows 97% of you chose that second option, which is really great to see. As we saw sort of throughout that last section, there's really alignment across this, and they're really building off of each other. So really starting with that TCFD, disclosures will set you up for what's coming down the pipeline in terms of the changing regulatory policy and standards environment. So it's great that that was clear and that you're aware of that. And with that, I think we're a bit behind time, but I think we still have time for a 5-minute break. So if everyone can come back 5 minutes after the hour, that would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's been about 5 minutes. I hope everyone had an opportunity to maybe do a quick stretch or grab themselves a coffee or tea for the next half of our session. Now, what we're going to be looking at next is the first core pillar of the TCFD's recommended disclosures. Now, just as a reminder to everyone that these are presented as separate core pillars, but of course they always work together and they should always be aligned. I'm going to work together today with my colleague Chuck from IFC, and we're going to go over governance and the tools you can use in order to tackle this particular pillar. First, I'm going to provide an overview of what the TCFD recommends you disclose pertaining to governance, and then Chuck's going to dig into some tools that you can use and how IFC can particularly support you in that journey. Now, just as a reminder here, we see all 4 pillars, and governance is, of course, on the outside of all of the pillars. It really helps with that alignment and the oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities in our organization. And of course, it's pertaining to the governance around climate-related risks and opportunities in our organization. Now, what specifically do we want to provide when we're talking about governance? Well, this checklist can help, but these are directly out of the TCFD's recommended disclosure. Now, if any of you are corporate governance experts, you might be used to thinking just at the board level, at the executive board or the supervisory board, but keeping it kind of at the board level. However, when we're looking at the TCFD's recommended disclosures, and we're talking specifically about this governance and the alignment and the oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities, we want to look both at the board and the management level. So the board's oversight includes understanding what is the board role and expertise, what are the board committees that will be addressing climate-related risks and opportunities, what is the board oversight and responsibilities, and the board's evaluation and performance. Now, it's important to note why investors want to understand this. It's because they want to get the context about how a bank governs and embeds climate-related risks and opportunities into their operations. So understanding who's on those committees, what expertise do they have pertaining to climate, how do they communicate is very important. Now, what's also important is that management's role, because boards don't act alone. They, of course, act together with the C-suite, with the managers in the organization. And it's really important not only to understand that oversight at the very top, but how that then interacts with the management. Who's managing these risks and opportunities that are being overseen? So in the management's role, what we want to understand is the management's responsibility pertaining to climate, the management's functions and committees, the associated organizational structures, and management level monitoring. For governance, what we really want to understand is what are these roles and what are the either committees or groups that are playing an important role in overseeing climate-related risks and opportunities, and what are the reporting lines? Does the board consider climate-related issues when reviewing strategy, risk management, policies, and financial expenditure? How does it monitor and oversee the metrics that are set? How is it evaluated, and how does it reach the board, and how do they make these decisions? So let's look at an example to see in practice what that means. Oh, sorry, I forgot about this one slide here. We already discussed that there is some progress being made. So here you can see, particularly in governance, I mentioned that banks are now doing quite well in governance. Overall, companies are improving significantly in governance as well. You'll see that in board oversight, companies are doing a little bit better providing information on the board oversight, and that usually has to do with because a traditional corporate governance is looking at that level. And then a little bit behind in management oversight. So here's an example from Scotiabank. And I think what's important here is this to outline here is that this example provides a narrative about the board oversight, where they talk about the bank's climate change strategy that was approved by the board, and the three committees, they mentioned three committees that are involved and their role in the management of climate-related risks and opportunities. But then they also talk, you can see a paragraph underneath, about the management's role, and particularly the role of the CEO and the chief risk officer. On a second page in the same report here, you can also see that they provide kind of an organogram to understand who reports to who and how communication unfolds, which we see in a lot of reports on the governance aspect. However, what's really important to note here is that we need to understand how climate fits in here. It's not enough to just mention how risk management holistically works in your organization. Investors need to understand how climate's particularly being evaluated. While climate risk and opportunities, once they're identified, should be treated like any other business risks, they are unique, and they are non-diversifiable, meaning that they will impact all organizations, and they also extend beyond traditional timelines. So for that, we need to have certain processes in place to ensure that we're catching these unique types of risks and opportunities that relate to climate. Now, one more example we have here is climate committee. They have a climate task team at Nedbank. Now, sorry, I think, oh, Nedbank, Chuck's going to handle. Sorry, Chuck, I'm going to pass to you to cover.
That's
Nedbank.
fine.
Okay, over to you.
Thank you so much. So yes, Nedbank's actually an IFC client from South Africa. And in 2021, we extended Nedbank a loan of $200 million to finance green operations and expand its climate portfolio. So what I like about Nedbank is that we can see where climate fits into the governance structure. So they've actually integrated climate governance into their overall corporate governance structure. And we can also see the reporting lines for the climate task team. So we see how the climate fits into the overall structure. And lastly, one thing I'd really like to point out is it's been well placed and embedded in a group structure. One large issue that's come up in the last decade is subsidiary governance, especially related to banks. And this is important as it shows it's just not issuing a green bond as a one-off and building governance around that bond in a silo approach, as Tiffany had mentioned earlier, but it's integrated throughout. Let's go to the second example. Next slide, please. So, oh, no, previous. Yes, this is Standard Bank, another IFC client, and it's the largest client by assets in South Africa. And what I really like here is that it shows specific roles and responsibilities that different risk committees have. And what I especially like about this disclosure is how the company notes its upscaling. If you look in the lower left corner, board upskilling. And this is really important because this is climate governance is a new area. And, listening to the earlier sessions, companies need to start building a plan on how to do this. And I like that this company is transparent about this, as it's a journey and you need to start somewhere. And one of the best ways to start is by training of the board. All boards need training in this area, absolutely. And expertise as well. We're going to see, in the next coming years that boards are going to really build out not only climate literacy, but climate expertise within their board structure. And with this client, IFC helped the company issue a $200 million green bond in 2020 via private placement. And this was South Africa's, or excuse me, Africa's largest green bond at the time. And then following this, the company issued a second green bond on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange sustainability segment for renewable energy projects in South Africa. So, you know, the one takeaway from here is, as what Tiffany showed, it's showing the structure within risk and strategy, but also showing how the board is upskilling its expertise and literacy in this area. Next slide, please. So we at IFC recognized this issue of companies struggling with sustainability, ESG, and climate reporting. And several years back, we issued a Beyond the Balance Sheet Disclosure and Transparency Toolkit to help companies start their journey on sustainable reporting in emerging markets. And that's where private sector is particularly critical to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the World Bank twin goals. And we at IFC have over 30 years ESG experience in working in emerging markets, and we have a wealth of knowledge supporting our clients to develop and implement better ESG practices. And the goal of this toolkit is to manage the gap between reporting and what investors want. And it's really a how-to guide, starting with very basic principles and how a company can begin its reporting journey beyond traditional financial reporting. And companies use the toolkit to improve its company reports in places like Kenya, China, Papua New Guinea, and Timor-Leste, where we helped a company issue its first ever annual report in that newly formed country. And we also use it to help regulators and stock exchanges through our partnership with UNSSE. And thus far, we've worked with 15 different sustainability guidelines to improve sustainability and climate reporting. Next slide, please. So this really gets to what we do at IFC. So in IFC, we look at the corporate governance of every single company that we invest in, every company. And so we realized a couple of years ago that we really needed to enhance and update our methodology to include a climate governance approach. So what we've really focused on in our methodology are 6 areas where we have commitment to better ESG, looking at leadership and commitment to climate resilience and creation of a appropriate culture, code of conduct, and integrating the climate into the company business model, that strategy as well as risk governance. Also, a key to this is the board. The functioning roles, skills of the board and evaluation of the board needs to include climate considerations. And then something we call the control environment. And by control environment, we basically mean the internal control system, the internal audit function, the risk management framework, the compliance function, as well as subsidiary governance, which I mentioned earlier. And here we really need to integrate E&S and climate risks and opportunities within all these systems. So the overall risk governance framework of an organization has elements of climate, as well as some elements of internal and external assurance. And another element that we have is, of course, disclosure and transparency, which we're talking about largely today, and as is addressed by the disclosure and transparency toolkit. And then we have some short provisions on governance of stakeholder engagement, ensuring a broader stakeholder model, and even elements of shareholder rights, where shareholders could approve climate transition plans. I would confess that in the IFC methodology, we have taken many of the provisions from TCFD and governance reporting and incorporated into our model. I think the last slide, I'll just cover briefly. TCFD has great resources for governance disclosure. Starting with the final recommendations and disclosure, the implementation guidance, and the supporting materials are very helpful. We get questions all the time from our clients, Chuck, how do we develop a scenario analysis? How do we develop the metrics and targets? Well, TCFD has a wealth of resources in this area, and I would very much urge you to take a look at these as you start your journey. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, today I'll be talking about climate resilience strategy. So I'm Mahim from the United Nations Environment Program's Finance Initiative, where I'm part of the Climate Risk and TCFD program as part of the climate. And today I am also joined with my colleagues, David and Leah, who are also on this call as well. So today I'll be focusing on strategy, which is one of the 4 pillars of the TCFD. And strategy disclosures are really important for showing a firm's understanding of its climate-related exposures and really its impact on the strategy, planning, and decision-making. So the pillar can really provide insights to the type, the magnitude, the time horizon of these climate-related exposures, and then what is their potential impact of these risks and opportunities. And strategy disclosures really need to address how an institution can then integrate these risks and opportunities into their strategy and financial planning. So over here, you can see a checklist or the recommendations by the TCFD, and there are really 3 main components. And these components can really be highlighted as first, identification of climate risk and opportunities, the impact of these risks and opportunities on an institution's business, strategy, and financial planning, and then the resilience of the organization's strategy in line with scenario analysis. So some key practices for this pillar really include disclosing details of the time horizon that is being used to identify these risks, just because different climate risks can manifest over different time horizons. So it's important when institutions provide justification for the horizons that are being used, and then to be able to link those horizons to the climate risk. And then it's also important to identify what methodologies and processes were really used to identify and assess these climate risks as well. And then it's also really important to provide the descriptions of the risks and opportunities that are identified, as well as their impacts on different lines of businesses, their impacts on costs, really, and then also to provide descriptions of the underlying methodologies used for calculating these risks as well. And then it's also important to really disclose how the organization then manages the impacts of the climate risk opportunities and risks and opportunities, and really linking those climate impacts to the planning process. And then finally, a really important component of the strategy pillar is scenario analysis. And as we go further along these slides, I'll also be talking a bit more on scenario analysis itself. So over here, you can see the strategy disclosure progress. So this is from the progress report that was released by the TCFD, and it really shows that the strategy A recommendation is really the one that companies are more likely to disclose information on. So they're more likely to disclose information on their climate-related risk and opportunities compared to any other disclosure as well. But you can also see a great amount of growth happening when it comes to that pillar. However, when you're looking at strategy C, which also includes scenario analysis, it still continues to be one of the lowest recommended disclosures that are being implemented by firms, really suggesting the difficulty firms are facing when it does come to strategy C and scenario analysis. So now I'll just be walking through a few examples on disclosing strategies and providing examples by institutions. So the first example that we have here is by the Royal Bank of Canada, which is a Canadian bank, and it really shows how scenario analysis was conducted. And it was then used as an opportunity to improve the institution's strategic resilience and to really explore its climate vulnerabilities. So you can see that using scenario analysis, the institutions were able to use the information that they gained from the analysis to look at which physical risks and which transition risks that they are vulnerable from. So they were able to get these learnings from the analysis, and then they were able to include in the report how they plan to address their findings when it comes to their strategy as well. So you can see that, for example, for the transition risk portion, they highlight looking at at-risk industries, and they said they so far have not revealed extreme impacts, but they do take into consideration methodological assumptions, but they will continue to assess transition risk. Similarly, when you look at the physical risk scenario, they also identify which risks have they identified or not, and then how are they going to use that for their future plans, and how do they plan to address these findings using these learnings here. And really, the report also details some strategic priorities that the bank has related to climate-related action. It is not included in this page here, but it can be found in their report. So the second example you can see is by the IFC. So in its strategy disclosure, the IFC has outlined integrating low carbon and other resilience strategies across sectors to really diversify and to be able to identify areas of growth and opportunities. So how was that done? So in the report, IFC really indicated that certain sectors may have a higher financial impact due to climate, and taking that into consideration, they are going to adjust their investment strategy. So really, this table on the slide then really illustrates IFC's investments by sector and how this aligns to their climate goals. So you can really see that this example then shows responses to climate opportunities, which are then being integrated into their strategy and has now been incorporated as part of their planning and analysis as well. So our next example here is by HSBC in Malaysia, and the table summarizes key categories for both transition and physical risk, and with examples of how their customers might be affected financially by these climate risks. So really, these climate risks that HSBC have provided are there, and these risks are the ones that the bank has decided will have a financial impact on the organization, and therefore they need to prioritize these risks and they need to manage them. So there are key aspects of this example that I would like to point out. First of all, in this example, they've used the TCFD's categorization of using both transition and physical risk. So for example, when looking at transition risk, they've pointed at various different risks, which will have a financial impact. So for example, they've looked at technology, how it could replace existing products. And similarly with physical risk, how rising temperatures and changing precipitation patterns would then have an impact on their customers. And in this example, as I've mentioned, they're looking at a specific business line. So they're looking at customers, but of course, there are other various financial impacts that can occur. But in this example, HSBC focuses on one in particular. And in this report as well, HSBC also provides a more deeper overview of their key climate risks, as well as they provide more detailed a more detailed description of how they then plan to respond to these risks as well. And then how these risks would then be incorporated into their financial planning and analysis. So the fourth example we have here is by the European Investment Bank and in its TCFD report. And what the bank did was it analyzed its portfolio's credit exposure to both transition and physical risk. And for example, you can see here that with their physical risk and both their transition risk exposure, they have a rating from 1 to 5, and so they've quantified the exposure to the institution, and they've shown visually on really how much of an exposure would physical risk have and how much of an exposure would transition risk have. And what they've identified is that physical risk would have there is a low risk of exposure when considering physical risk for the institution. However, the risk of exposure is greater when looking at transition risk. And really what's important to note is the methodology that the firm used. So they used scenario analysis, and really they undertook a methodology of using a climate risk screening tool. So really the tool provided scores for counterparts on a scale from 1 to 5, 1 being low risk and 5 being high risk, as you can see on the slide as well. And really, the one thing I like to also point out is that it looked at both physical and transition risk. And it's also important when you are thinking about your strategy disclosure when reporting, it is whether you want to consider physical and transition risk separately or jointly, and if you want also detail possible interactions between the both. And the other important thing I'd like to point out is really considering the magnitude of the exposure in this example as well. And if you read the report, it also details the methodology that was used to do so. So now I will be moving on to the next part of today's training, which is at our interactive exercise, looking at scenario analysis. So we're going more into a bit more in depth about the scenario analysis component when it comes to strategy. So first, I will really outline the use cases for climate scenarios. So as you can see, it's that climate scenarios have really become an indispensable part of financial users' toolkit. You can say there's so many different benefits when it comes to climate scenario analysis, and there are a variety of use cases for this. For example, climate scenario analysis can be used for setting climate-related targets, developing a climate strategy, making internal or external climate disclosures, improving underwriting as well, and meeting regulatory requirements such as climate stress testing. So really these use cases range across the financial sector, across all levels. You can see climate scenario analysis being important from executives to those involved in underwriting to those undertaking stress testing. And as I mentioned, climate scenario analysis is really an important aspect of the TCFD framework. And it's really used to assess potential business, strategic, and financial implications of climate-related risk and opportunities. And really, scenario analysis and can be a tool for assessing the potential financial impact of different pathways. In the coming slides, I'll just be talking about what those pathways look like. So one thing I would like to point out that these climate scenarios that are used are from these integrated assessment models, IAMs, and these are what are used by financial firms when it comes to assessing their climate risks. And IAMs were initially not developed to be used by the financial sector. So they were developed for policymakers to really describe the relationship between economic activities, greenhouse gas emissions, and climate change. And now they're being used by the financial sector. And these pathways that are produced by IAMs provide changes in energy production, energy demand, looking at technological changes, changes in consumption, implementation of climate policy. And these models really provide details on energy systems, and they tend to make other simplified assumptions related to climate systems and land use. And basically what these models are used is that, first of all, they show a combination and timing of different emissions mitigation approaches that can be taken to reach a specific warming target. So what climate scenarios are then useful for is being able to see the differences, or you can even say the trade-offs between different climate mitigation pathways to reach a certain degree of warming. And what is important to note is that there are a number of scientists and modelers that have developed these scenarios to be used as a reference for firms to conduct their scenario analysis. And in the coming slides, we'll be talking about one set of these climate scenarios, but there are very different climate scenarios available that have been developed by different modelers. Sorry, I'm just trying to move my slide. Oops. Okay, this is the right slide. Okay, so now what I'll be talking about is what is the scenario framework of these climate scenarios. And what I'll be focusing on are scenarios by the NGFS. And the NGFS is the Network for Greening the Financial System. And they are a group of central banks who have developed these reference climate scenarios. And the scenarios that we'll be talking about today will be focusing on the NGFS. But before we get into those specific narratives, what I would like to cover is these four, we can call the four components of a scenario framework. So when we're looking at scenario narratives, they tend to belong to one of these categories. And these can be orderly scenarios, disorderly scenarios, hot house world, and a too little, too late. And when we're looking at orderly scenarios, what those are, those scenarios then assume that climate policies are introduced early and gradually they become more stronger, they become more stringent. And both physical and transition risk are therefore very low, just because these climate policies have come into place early and have been strengthened gradually. The second category is the disorderly scenarios, and these really explore a delay in the implementation of policies. And because there is a delay and there is divergence between countries and sectors on how these climate policies are implemented, it leads to higher transition risk. And typically carbon prices get higher as well with a delay. And then we have a hot house world scenarios. And these scenarios really assume that some climate policies are implemented in some jurisdictions, but really global efforts are insufficient to really limit global warming. So we see an extreme rise in global temperature and we see severe physical risks. And then finally, we have the too little, too late scenarios, in which there is a late transition, but because the transition is late, you also see higher physical risks for this. And we will be also continuing on in the other slides on some of the scenario narratives that the NGFS has developed and has released and where they fit into these categories. Again, I would just like to mention the NGFS scenarios are not the only scenarios that are available. There are various different options available to use these scenarios for financial use as well. And really, when it comes to choosing what type of scenarios you would like to use, this can be based on a specific climate target that you're looking at, specific sector or regional granularity that you want, supervisory expectations, and really looking and understanding other key assumptions of these scenarios. Also, when it comes to scenario analysis, it is a progressive journey. And it is progressive and it continues to be expanded. These scenarios continue to be updated. It is really continuing to use the latest data, and really there's a continuation and a continual improvement and progress when it comes to using scenario analysis. Yes, so in this slide, really quickly, I would like to highlight some of the TCFD resources that are available for these strategy disclosures. So all of these resources have been published by the TCFD. So they've published recommendations, implementation guides, and they've also published additional materials on scenario analysis that I would recommend the participants today to take a look at. Great. Just so we have more time for our interactive exercise, I will just skip this question. Great. So as I mentioned, we are going to have an interactive exercise. So the next 3 slides I will go over just to support you for the exercise that we have planned. These slides can also be found in the handout that was given to you. So I would recommend everyone to also take a look at that handout. So this slide is quite similar to the previous slide where I went over the different categories of a scenario framework. So similarly, the slide looks at what do the orderly scenarios include, what do the disorderly scenarios include, similarly the hot house world scenarios, and then the too little, too late scenarios. And I will skip on the slide just because I did go over it. However, like I mentioned, this is in your handout, so I would recommend everyone to take a look at it. So on this slide, what you can see are 6 narratives that have been released by the NGFS. And these 6 narratives then fit into 3 of the scenario categories that I went through. So these fit into the orderly category, disorderly, and the hot house world. And I would just like to mention, so these narratives were really, they were released as part of phase 2 of the NGFS scenarios, which was last year. And then recently they've released a updated version, phase 3, which includes the same narratives, but include updated information and the latest information. So what do each of these narratives include? So I'll quickly be going over these narratives. So to begin with, when you look at the orderly scenarios, there are 2. You have the net zero 2050, which looks at limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And this is to global action reaching net zero emissions by net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. And it's really global action together, which leads to limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Then you have the below 2 degrees, which is a gradual increase in the stringency of climate policies, which then allows warming to be limited to below 2 degrees. So those are your two orderly scenarios. Then we have two disorderly scenarios by the NGFS. So the first one is a divergent net zero. So similar to the net zero 2050 scenario that you can see on the top, this scenario also reaches net zero around 2050, but the pathway to which this occurs is different. It is more disorderly. It is because there are divergent policies that are introduced across sectors, across regions. So really, the phase out and reduction in emissions is a lot slower. However, it does reach net zero by 2050, but with higher costs associated. Then you have the delayed transition scenario, which assumes that emissions do not decrease until 2030. So policies, climate policies are not strengthened until 2030. So there is that delay in response, which then leads to warming being limited to below 2 degrees, but there is a delayed transition. And then we have the nationally determined contributions. So these are basically all the pledge policies that are not yet implemented. And then we have the current policies, which assumes that only current policies are the ones that are in place and there are no additional policies. Now what I would just like to highlight on the right side is basically these scenarios then differ in terms of the warming that is shown in terms of the temperature, their warming goal on their temperature, and also by the CO2 emissions then that are included in the pathway. And then they also differ in their carbon price. So for example, as you can see, the lower the warming temperature is, the higher the carbon price that is being implemented. So really quickly, I will go through the last slide before our exercise. And it really shows what are some of the key drivers for these physical and transition risks. So it really shows that physical risk and transition risk are being categorized by some of these key drivers, which can be policy ambition, policy reaction, technological change, looking at carbon dioxide removal, and really regional variation. So for example, for physical risk, the biggest lever you can see is policy ambition. The more ambitious the policy, lower the warming temperature and lower the physical risk. Then you have your transition risk, and this can really depend on which scenario you look at. So if you're limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, for example, you see immediate policies being implemented. You see faster technological change, which means phase out of fossil fuels and more energy alternatives like renewables. You also see in lower warming temperatures, there's a greater use of carbon dioxide removal, and there seems to be variations in policies that are being implemented depending on which scenario they're in. And again, like I mentioned, please take a look at the handout as well, which has information. So now we can carry on to our exercise. So again, so these slides were really to help you be able to answer these questions. So for Menti, it would be great if you could use the link that was posted in the chat, or use the QR code, or you go to menti.com and write down the code mentioned on the slide. And we have 4 questions to get through regarding these NGFS scenarios, just to get your thoughts on these scenarios themselves. Great. So as you can see, if everyone could just click on the link in the chat, or if you could go to menti.com and use the code 16061942 and really submit your answers. So the first really asks which narratives you find the most plausible in the NGFS scenario. So again, these are just pathways to a certain warming temperature. So out of these different pathways, what do you think is the one
I'm just, oh, Maheen's back. Okay. I wasn't sure if it was me or you. I can't hear you though now, Maheen. Do you want to try?
sorry,
Oh,
yeah.
perfect. Okay,
That's
you're
me.
back.
My Zoom just shut down, but hopefully that gave everyone enough
Time
time
to
to submit
answer.
their responses. Yes.
Great.
So for those who say access denied, please write your responses in the chat as well. So what we're seeing is really a variation. So again, some people, I think that response really sums in. Optimistic answer would be orderly, where you see early action being taken place. Others might say disorderly, that there is going to be action, but it might be delayed. There is also divergent net zero. So we would reach net zero by 2050, just it will be across different sectors at different times as well. So I think we can go on to the next question. Is then what do you think are the biggest challenges that a 1.5 degree pathway presents? So it'd be great if everyone could just write down their thoughts. So what do you think might be the biggest challenge for institutions when you're looking at these pathways and some of their key drivers? So again, I think we have these responses coming in. So I think capital is a big one. Really, we need to finance that transition, and the amount of investments that are needed both from the public and the private sectors is really important. I think policy is very important. I can see that here as well. So I think in these pathways, carbon price is often used as a proxy for policies as well, and just really just looking at these 1.5 degree pathways, understanding when would these policies actually be implemented as well, investments in capital as well, and then decarbonizing emerging markets, and that's a good point. So really different types of transitions and different pathways will be needed depending on the region as well. And really country commitments is also an important one. So different countries have made these commitments to reach net zero, but being able to do so as well, and really financing the initiative, and also really being able to take that action. Awareness is an important point. So one of the main aspects for the transition is also demand side behavior as well, and changing those demand side measures, which the IPCC has also covered in its latest assessment report 6. So really those demand side measures are also going to play an important role when it comes to limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And similarly, I think knowledge gap is also a very important aspect of being aware of the transition that's needed and what is needed as well. So we can go on to the next question. So then how do changes in carbon prices impact emissions, energy mix, transition risk, pace of the transition, and other economic activities? So this question is really asking you to think about carbon price. And carbon price is an important aspect of these scenario pathways, depending on the level of warming you are looking at. And this is really just asking you to see, well, in those pathways, for example, you have below 2 degrees and then 1.5 degrees. Carbon price plays an important role, but well, how is that? What is the role that it is playing? How is it impacting your energy mix, your transition? So we do have responses coming in. So again, I want you to also think about how carbon price could then play a role in phasing out fossil fuels and increasing renewable energy, its impact on carbon dioxide removal as well, really being used as a tool for the transition. So carbon price, like the responses mentions, is important as well on reducing emissions, and that's why it's often used as that proxy in these pathways. So higher the carbon price, lower the emissions are as well. And then I think we can see others as well. Just really implementing those carbon prices can be important. It is going to make energy transition faster. And I think that's one of the key points here, that it would raise costs for fossil fuels, which would increase the transition towards renewables, which are already decreasing in cost in such a fast rate as well. And providing economic incentives is also a very important aspect of carbon prices as well. And then finally, what scenario that is not in the NGFS scenario set would you like to see? And over here, I think it'd be good if you consider, are there any shocks or are there any drivers that were mentioned in the that you want included that weren't mentioned in the NGFS scenario set? So thinking about the shocks, those drivers, also about the time horizon as well. So really considering certain aspects. So just with responses coming in, it's important to remember that the NGFS actually does have two orderly scenarios. That's their net zero 2050 and their below 2 degrees scenarios. And they do have that 1.5 degree scenario with that net zero 2050. So really, what are some other narratives? So for example, when we're saying net zero 2075, 1 degree. Yeah, so you can also think about, what about the time horizons? So right now, these are long-term scenarios. Would you like to see short-term scenarios, maybe more shock scenarios? Also, it is important to know that the NGFS doesn't have a little too late scenario yet. So maybe that is one aspect that would be useful to have a scenario on as well. Yes, and just because I'm seeing a number of responses that do say orderly and net zero scenarios, I would just like to remind you that those are in these scenarios that are provided by the NGFS right now, but more shock scenarios, short-term scenarios as well. Net zero by 2030, that'd be interesting to see as well. And scenarios focus on 5 years from now, so really having that a 5-year scenario perhaps to align with the time horizons used in financial assessments, in financial crisis, and oil shock would be a good one as well. Great, so I think that is the end of our interactive exercise, and I will just pass it back to Tiffany.
Great. Thanks so much, Maheen, for whizzing us through a scenario analysis and how all organizations can get started or progress on the scenarios that they're already using. We are short, very short on time, 3 minutes to fill your toolbox. So I will point you towards your handout where all of these resources are hyperlinked to, so you can get them all. Note that we have the TCFD recommended disclosures, which is always a great starting point if you're just getting started. The SSE's model guidance on climate disclosure, which can help anyone who is getting started and point you in the direction of all the great resources. And of course, we've mentioned it many times, the TCFD Knowledge Hub, but if you're not using the hub, you're not getting access to all the wonderful and new resources that come out all the time. Also here, I will point out the scenario analysis disclosure guideline, the technical supplement by TCFD is very helpful as you're starting to move forward on a scenario analysis. And of course, there's a specific training on scenario analysis on the Learning Hub at the TCFD Knowledge Hub. And of course, you can also get through the NGFS portal additional guidance there. Okay, one more key resource, TCFD for banks. If you are already aware of it, they keep updating resources, but I'll point you in that direction as well. And we've provided a number of guidelines that have come from central banks and countries that you can use as you're moving forward. So these are all also hyperlinked in the back of your checklist. And we provide a list of tools here from UNEP-FI's Climate Risk Tool Landscape, their 2022 supplement. So here we have transition risk tools, and on the next page, physical risk tools. So please make use of all these wonderful tools and resources you can have at your disposal now. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions. I'm very sorry. We likely will have time at the end next time because we have a little less content next time. Just to highlight, to get your CPD certificate, you do have to participate in today and tomorrow's session. So please do join us early. We are capped at 500. So please join early so that you make sure you get your spot in tomorrow's session. And then we'll tell you tomorrow how to get your CPD certificate. I'm going to skip through tomorrow's agenda because I don't want to take advantage of your time. And I'm going to say a big thank you to all of our organizers, to the IFC, to my colleagues at SSE, to UNEP-FI, and to CDP. Thank you for this great collaboration. And thanks everyone for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again, same time, same place tomorrow. Thanks everyone. Have a great day.